My name is Jim O'Connor, and I'll be moderating questions. For those of you I haven't met, I'm a project director at Advance Illinois. I'm also an elected school board member in District 97 here in Oak Park. Advance Illinois is a nonprofit organization founded to be an independent, objective voice for a public education system in Illinois that prepares all students to be ready for work, college, and democratic citizenship. We have 4 goals at Advance Illinois: promote and stimulate progressive thinking on education, reflect statewide values and experiences, and make education a key issue in Illinois government. And finally, leverage grassroots support for legislative and regulatory change. We are honored to be one of the sponsors of tonight's presentation. We have a great mix of people in the room, and I'm sure that our questions will reflect that. In terms of organizations, we have 210 people from K-12 institutions, both public neighborhood schools and public charter schools. We have 66 people from colleges and universities, including teacher preparation programs, faculty, and graduate students. This is indeed a great mix of individuals. And now let's get to questions.
Yes, the short answer is yes. There are lessons to be learned from other places, and Illinois is also going to be in a position to teach some other states. My view on this at the moment is that the places where, and I do get a chance to travel around a lot, and encounter people laboring under various mandates. The most successful ones, and I would put Illinois in this group for most of it, are the ones where they aren't in too big a hurry, where people have a chance to get used to the whole system, to whatever the foundation for it is going to be, if it's the framework for teaching, my personal favorite, or some other one, that people get an opportunity to understand it and to engage with it before it is used in any high-stakes way to evaluate their performance. That takes time. And so Arkansas, for example, is a state that has had a rather measured but deliberate rollout over several years, and I see that happening in Illinois as well, which I admire. In some other states, they've been in a big hurry. They passed a law in, say, July, and it had to be implemented by September, and people were just in a panic and sort of deer-in-the-headlights look. So in my view, that's the most important finding. The other one is to invest adequately in training, in professional development for teachers and supervisors, so that everybody has confidence in the system. Anyway, those would be my 2 major takeaways from other places.
And I would just add a couple more, and I would draw on specifically Cincinnati and the DC impact system, which I know is a controversial thing to say. But just drawing on particular aspects of what they've done that I think are useful. One is Cincinnati was among the first places to use colleagues or peer observations as a part of their teacher evaluation system, and really with an eye toward bringing in multiple observers and multiple perspectives into the evaluation system, which I think is incredibly important. It's important for 2 reasons. It's important for fairness, but it's also important for logistics, because it's impossible in some cases for principals to be able to conduct all of these evaluations themselves. This shift from using a checklist to using a framework is, while wonderful, also takes a lot more time. So I think on both of those dimensions, in terms of fairness and also in terms of logistics, it makes sense. Just briefly on the DC system, we keep talking about multiple measures, and I think that DC was among the first systems to really try that, to understand what that means. What does it mean to use a student growth measure, an observation rubric, a lot of different observers in the classroom, and both of these systems had an eye on teacher development, which is another critical part of this. But I would put what's happened in Illinois on level with many of those systems as well.
Great, so the first question from the audience is a scale question. So I think this maybe, Sarah, you can start with this. How many teachers did principals observe in the pilot? Feasibly, how many observations can a principal do well in a year?
Wow. That's a hard question to generalize, but I'll take a stab at it and talk about, this, in the first year of the pilot, principals did just a handful of teachers. And part of the reason for that was Chicago is on an every year observation system for tenured teachers. And the first year was an off year for tenured teachers. And so it was only non-tenured teachers who were being observed for the most part. There were some exceptions to that, teachers who were rated satisfactory the previous year. In the second year, there were principals who were in fact doing their whole staff as a part of this. It just depended on the school. Some were doing some of their teachers, some were doing all of their teachers. Now, I'll just put a caveat on all of this. The results that I just showed you were from elementary schools only. There was no high school pilot in Chicago. And so we don't actually have a good picture of what this would look like at the high school level, depending on how many observers, certified observers there are. So it's hard for me to answer the question to pin a number on that. There are some principals who were very highly effective at observing all of their teachers 2 times a year. And I think that it's important for us to learn from principals who learned how to manage their time in a way appropriate to do that. There were other principals who struggled to be able to do that. So I can't give you an absolute number, but I will say that this is going to be one of the challenges that districts face, and that the best resource for finding answers to these time challenges is to go to principals who've mastered this, because there are many who have.
Yeah, let me just add briefly, there are a few findings out of the MET study that are relevant here. One is good news and one is bad news. I'll start with the bad news. The bad news is that they found in the MET project that it wasn't until you had 3 or better yet 4 observations, ideally by 4 different people of a single teacher's practice, that you got really good high levels of reliability. That's the bad news. The good news is they can be brief. The observations that 18 minutes was as good as 45, which was a rather surprising finding to me, actually, and I resisted it. But it turned out to be true, that they carefully studied that, and they had 45-minute lessons, then they did them in 15-minute segments, and they found actually that any of those 15 minutes, you would get the same results as if you watched the whole lesson. So that was sort of counterintuitive, but good news in the sense of workload. But to more directly answer the question, you can do the arithmetic. You know, how many teachers are there? How long? How many observations do you want to have? Of what length? Multiply it out, divide it by the number of observers you've got, certified, trained, and certified, and you can see how many of them it will take, and whether or not you have that amount of person. I do think it's a serious workload issue, as Sarah just said. Some places are actually being rather creative about it, and they are hiring sort of building managers to offload some of the other non-instructional duties that many principals find themselves burdened with. So this will be a challenge, there's no doubt about it, and I'm sure that everybody will be interested if anyone comes up with creative solutions to it, and in addition to using, having other players in it, like department chairs, peers, mentors, and so on.
So a question from the field. What do you suggest for building a positive relationship moving forward, given the following? Over the past several years, teachers have been told you cannot earn higher than a basic rating because you are not tenured, or we've been told by the district that this is new to us. So that's what teachers should receive. So I guess questions about this doesn't seem fair. How do you start with building that relationship?
I honestly couldn't understand the question.
Sure,
I'm sorry.
that's right.
Would you mind reading it again?
Sure.
Maybe I'm too tired.
Sure.
Try one more time.
Over the past several years, teachers have been told you cannot earn a rating higher than basic because you are not tenured, or we've been told by the district that this is new to us, so that's what the teacher should receive. So a basic rating is sort of there's a perception that the basic rating is really the highest rating you can receive. And how do you build relationships given that?
Got that. I'm not sure how to answer that politely. This is why we have rubrics that have words in them. I mean, I'm not trying to make a political statement, but honestly, that's why we have rubrics with words in them, so you can actually interpret evidence against the rubric. And now, it is the case that most first-year teachers, because they are inexperienced, many of them will perform at a basic level, but not all. not all, and not in everything. And there should absolutely, in my view, be no rule about that. Otherwise, why have a rubric? Just have numbers and just say you can't get higher than a number 2. So no, I just don't think that's a productive approach.
I also would add, this is, again, I've made this point several times, but this is the importance of having checks built into your system, because while it's the case that I stress the consistency of most principles in the pilot, there were certainly some in which we did see that they were rating differently depending on who the teacher was. And so it wasn't the case that they were applying the rubric fairly, just looking at the criteria. They were taking other things into account, whatever that might be. And so I think this again adds some weight to making sure that we're ensuring fairness, that the tool itself doesn't ensure that, that only the systems around it ensure the fair use of the tool.
And Jim, I'd just like to add one more thing to that question, because it reminds me that that because many of the colleges of higher education, the preparation programs, are also using this same framework, that teachers are likely to come into the profession better prepared than they would have done without, which is great news for both the teachers and the schools, right? And so in fact, you might see more first-year teachers at a higher level of performance than you would have done earlier without that. And by the way, I'll say one more thing too, that if you work in a preparation program and you're placing student teachers in schools that use the framework for teaching, the cooperating teachers themselves will also be familiar with this, and they can give consistent feedback to the teachers, and especially if the university supervisors are also using the same, looking at teaching through the same lens. So I think you have it in your reach now to have a much more coherent system than we've ever been able to have before.
Okay, next question. How can we ensure that union negotiations don't impact the fidelity of implementation of a system like the framework? Some districts in Illinois have dropped the distinguished rating, for example.
Really?
According to this questionnaire, it is the case. And there's several folks in the audience who are actually going through union negotiations in Illinois. So
yeah,
any advice for them?
I mean, I would only say that, and I mean, I would defer to Audrey.
I would say hire Audrey.
Well, right. Yeah. I mean, I don't think, in my experience but I'm not the expert, we have an expert in the room, that everybody wants the same thing here. Everybody wants a system that is fair, that promotes growth, that ensures good quality teaching. And by the way, let me just say one last thing on the issue of promoting growth. As a friend and colleague of mine likes to say, we're not going to fire our way to Finland. we might grow our way to Finland. That's what we have to do, right? It's about learning. I don't know any union activist who's against that.
And I also
wants a fair system.
Want to point out that in these negotiations, the kind of disagreements are real. These are about imperfect ways of measuring something that's very complex, as Charlotte said. And so we shouldn't dismiss the fact that there are challenges to student growth and there are challenges to using student perceptions to measure teacher quality. And so I think we have to really engage in these conversations knowing full well that the system that we're building, no matter how elegant it is, has challenges and will not work correctly or perfectly for all teachers all the time. And so I think that the most productive union district leadership conversation should start with that premise, that what we're building is not perfect, and we have to constantly go back and assess and recreate and perfect it over time, but that the commitment should be to teacher development and ultimately to student growth and student achievement.
So there's several reforms happening in Illinois at the same time. This next questioner gets at that. How does the Danielson framework mesh with the adoption of the Common Core standards, and can you discuss the impact?
Yeah, let me speak to that. That's a really important question. I'm so glad it came up. There are these initiatives going on simultaneously, and I can imagine everybody is sort of on initiative overload at the moment. But let me point out some reassuring things on this one question at least. And that is the Common Core, what I'm reading into it, is proposing a view of student learning that is about depth and complex understanding and rigor and argumentation and really wonderful outcomes for students, you're in luck, because the framework for teaching is grounded in exactly those same assumptions, and you'll find it if you read into the text, not just the rubrics. Where it plays out in specific actions that teachers do is primarily in domain 1, the planning and preparation, in the outcomes that teachers select for their students and to make sure that those are compatible with the Common Core curriculum standards, and then the teachers need the skill to actually help students achieve them. Those are exactly the skills that are in the framework for teaching. And so there's no disconnect there. I think there will be an opportunity to further elaborate those connections, and I look forward to that opportunity. That's basically the thrust of what CPS were the suggestions that they were making for some minor tweaks to the framework, and when that comes through and moves forward, I think that will be a contribution, and I think we can all learn from that. And so I do believe that there's growth there to be had, but that the underlying premises of the framework for teaching are entirely compatible with the Common Core.
Well, there's so many good questions here. I'm going to combine a couple of them and what I think will be the last question for this portion of the presentation. So from two questions, I'm concerned that when the novelty of the system and the check of the researchers are gone, the principals revert to using this tool the way they did the old one. What is your recommendation for creating inter-rater reliability as a district implements new systems?
This is a real fear, honestly. And this is something that I often say about our research publicly is one of the kind of inadvertent things that we did was provide checks on principals in the system, right? Because they knew that when there was an external observer in the room, that they should probably do their most careful rating. And so in that respect, we provided an accountability for the way that ratings were enacted in Chicago during the pilot period that wouldn't occur naturally in a district. You wouldn't have that many external observers watching the same practice at the same time as principals. And so I think this is a really important point, that these checks have to be built in. So how do you do it? I think there are a lot of different ways to do it. That you do this by having multiple observers over the course of a year. So if there are 4 observation windows, as Charlotte just suggested was important for reliability, then you balance out the overall summative rating with these multiple perspectives. So that's one way to do this. Another way to do this is actually using external observers to specifically go in and watch practice with principals to spot check what they're doing over time. And so the districts actually put external observers in for the purpose of looking at reliability with principals over time. But I'm going to argue too that the use of technology is going to become really, really important in this, and I'm not going to say too much about it because Rem and Charlotte are going to actually talk about this in the next segment. But I think that what technology has now provided for us is the opportunity for principals to rate practice of a video and immediately get feedback on how a master observer rated the same lesson. And I think this could be used in a way that checks principals' reliability over time, because if we think about the scale question, we're not going to be able to spot check all principals in a large urban district. So I would say those are the ways that we can get at building this in. But it would be a mistake to ignore that and to not attend to making checks on reliability over time.
Yeah, I'll only add that that one of the things we know about assessor accuracy is that drift is real. And as some people like to say, you pass the test on Monday and you start drifting on Tuesday. And it is a danger. And so an ongoing calibration effort is in order. Some districts I know have, even after everybody's been trained and certified, they still devote an administrator meeting one a month, to watch a brief video and watch it together and talk about it, just to keep them on their game. So it's an ongoing challenge. And there's no reason, by the way, that that sort of training should be restricted to evaluators and administrators, because mentors and coaches also observe teachers and give feedback and need to be accurate in what they see. And so it's stepping up everybody's game to understand good practice and what it looks like. And we will be talking a little bit more about that in a moment.
Great, thank you. We have time for just a couple more questions, and I'm going to start with the first one from our folks in teacher preparation. We have 31 faculty members here, including 5 deans in the audience. Based on your work and research, do you have any advice for ed school deans and teacher prep faculty that are in the room about how they might design their program in order to help their graduates be successful?
So I would start by saying that, and this goes back to comments that Charlotte and I both made earlier about the ways in which we can integrate this way of thinking developmentally about teachers in a way that spans back into teacher education. And this isn't a point that I made tonight, but I often do in presentations, that I think unless we're attending to the whole pipeline of training teachers on the front end, who we select, how we train them, how we support them once they land in the classroom, if we're not attending to those pieces, we can't address the teacher quality issues that we have. So it starts there. It starts with that pipeline. And so thinking about using something like the framework for teaching as a part of the developmental process of training teachers, I think is critically important. And I'll just point to the example from our own urban teacher education program at University of Chicago, that this is something that we do very intentionally. That when our aspiring teachers are in the classroom doing their takeovers, when we're in their classroom doing induction work, that we're using these kind of developmental tools, these frameworks, from the very beginning of their training. This is how they self-assess, this is how they are assessed by the coaches who come into their classrooms. And I would venture to say that if we do that, if we're integrating these kind of ways of thinking and these kind of tools into the way that we're training teachers, that we can promote school level change and district level change that's much more powerful than what we can do just around individual teachers. It's the shared language and the shared way of thinking about what effective teaching is that we're building into the system.
Let me just add one thing to that. And because I'm delighted there's so many teacher preparation people here, and it just speaks to your commitment to the larger effort. If you have as part of your program that your students go into schools and observe experienced teachers early in their training, why not send them into classrooms to watch and learn from experienced teachers of how they do these things in the framework? That is, not to have their own performance assessed, but to learn from the experienced practitioners whose practice they are observing. So how does a teacher establish the efficient routines, for example? Or how do they use questioning techniques? And so it will focus how they look at what they're seeing and therefore be more discerning.
Just last comment too, we have a couple of university partners who are using video early on for year one prep program, in the year one prep program, so that at the very beginning, teachers, as part of their materials, they get an iPod Touch and a little stand and a mic, and so when they're teaching, they capture themselves, and they get used to seeing, that can be quickly uploaded, and you get used to seeing yourself teach early on. It can also be loaded with Charlotte's framework right on the screen. So if that's something that's been introduced, then I have a chance to reflect and to see the rubric always in front of me. And then, if I spend my first year doing a lot of self and peer reflection, at some point later, I may be at a place where I can start to be observed and evaluated on it.
Okay, I think this is probably our last question. Is there a separate training protocol for evaluating specialists like social workers, school psychologists and therapists, et cetera?
I'll pick up the mic. That's a really important question, because many of you who have Charlotte's Enhancing Professional Practice editions, the second edition, know in Chapter 5 that she has rubrics that have been drafted, though of course each district will review and personalize for the psychologists, for the library media specialists, and so on. At this point, the certification, the pre-qualification training, while it does address the requirements of the law to what we look at with student growth, as well as talk about The differences of the practice, we don't actually have assessment priorities built into the pre-qualification. I think as we've talked about, this is a work in progress, and I think that's definitely a next step that we would want to, because we really want to be able to honor and personalize the work that those specialists do to enhance student learning. But it's not in the pre-qualification or the assessments at this point beyond what the law just requires us to know about specialist work in student growth.